The drive was already in my pocket when Ambassador Suradin smiled at me. He smiled the way you smile at a child who has wandered into a room full of adults, warmly, briefly, and with absolutely no intention of letting me stay. He had silver blue skin, 4 fingers on each hand, and the kind of patience that came from living 300 years. I had 2 cups of bad transit coffee in my system, 14 hours of hyperspace lag in my bones, and a small silver drive tucked behind my identification card. My name is Zara Ose. I am 38 years old. I am Earth's appointed delegate to the Centennial Summit of the Galactic Sovereignty, and when I stepped off the transit pod onto the station called the Pale Crown, the first thing I saw was a wall, not a physical wall, a registry. It covered the entire entry hall, a curved surface the height of a 4-story building, listing every species attending the summit, their tier, their cipher status, their standing in the sovereignty. The hall was enormous and full of beings I had only ever read about in classified files, and none of them looked at the wall because they already knew where they stood. I found Earth in under a minute. Tier 7, minor species, emergent, pre-cipher, not yet coherent. There was a footnote. I read it twice to make sure I had not misunderstood. The footnote said, developmental trajectory under passive observation, estimated cipher coherence, 4 to 6 centuries. I stood in front of that wall for a long moment. Around me, delegates from 11 sovereign civilizations moved through the hall in long coats and ceremonial sashes, carrying translation devices and data tablets, speaking in languages that sounded like music or machinery depending on which species was speaking. A group of tall gray beings walked past me without a glance. 2 small, copper-colored creatures with wide black eyes looked at me with what might have been curiosity or pity. I could not tell which. I had been studying exolinguistics for 15 years. I had spent the last 4 preparing for this moment. I had read every intercepted transmission, every translated document, every recovered signal from the outer bands. I had learned more about the galactic sovereignty from fragments and shadows than most people on Earth knew existed, and I was still officially pre-cipher, not yet coherent. I took a breath. I picked up my bag. I went to find my room. The station called the Pale Crown was not a station in any sense I had grown up with. It was a structure roughly 200 kilometers from end to end, shaped like a long curved spine, with branching chambers growing off it, the way coral grows off a reef. It had been built 1100 years ago by the founding species of the sovereignty, and it had been expanded by every species that joined them since. The result was a place that looked like no single thing. It looked like everything. It looked like what happens when 17 civilizations spend a millennium deciding what a meeting place should be. My quarters were in a wing called the observation tier. That was not an irony the sovereignty intended, but it was not one they had thought to avoid either. The observation tier was where delegations below Tier 4 were housed, close enough to attend formal events, far enough from the central chambers that their absence would not disrupt anything important. The room was clean and comfortable and had a large window that looked out at open space. I dropped my bag on the bed and sat down next to it and looked out at the stars for a few minutes. They looked exactly the same as they did from home. I had not expected that to comfort me, but it did. Then I took out my tablet and reviewed my schedule. The Centennial Summit ran for 7 days. The first 2 days were social, receptions, introductions, ceremonial exchanges. The core events were on days 3 through 5. The Cipher Exchange, the Treaty Renewal Hearings, and the Classification Council. Day 6 was open deliberation. Day 7 was the final vote on all pending motions. One of those pending motions was about Earth. I had not been told the exact language of the motion before I left home. My director, a careful and cautious man named Colin Price, had briefed me thoroughly on everything else and had been deliberately vague about this one thing. He had said, there may be a proposal regarding Earth's future observer status. He had said, I need you to be present for it and I need you to be calm. He had said, take the drive, show nothing, wait for the right moment. I had asked him what the right moment would look like. He had looked at me for a long time. Then he had said, you'll know. I set the tablet down and picked up the drive. It was small enough to sit in my closed fist and leave room to spare. Brushed silver, no markings. I had carried it so long it had taken on the warmth of my body. I knew exactly what was on it. I had spent 4 years helping to build it. I put it back in my pocket and went to the first reception. The reception hall was on the central spine of the station, a vast open space with a ceiling made of some material that shifted slowly between transparency and deep amber, so that at one moment you could see the stars above you and at the next you stood beneath a warm golden canopy. It was, I admitted to myself, genuinely beautiful. Ambassador Suradin found me within 20 minutes. He was the senior diplomat of the Veth Koral Empire, which was a Tier 1 civilization and had been one of the founding members of the sovereignty. He was tall, silver blue, and old in the way that some things are old. Not worn down but worn smooth, every edge rounded by centuries of careful use. He spoke to me in standard English. This was considered a courtesy. I knew it was also a way of keeping me in a conversational space where I could not surprise him. He asked how I was finding the station. I said it was remarkable. He said Earth had sent a representative to the previous summit as well. I said yes, Dr. Patel, 15 years ago. He said he remembered. He said Dr. Patel had been very pleasant. He said it with warmth, the way you remember someone who had come and gone and left nothing complicated behind. Then he explained the cipher to me. I let him. I could have stopped him at any point. I had been studying cipher theory for 4 years, but I listened with the attentiveness of someone hearing it for the first time, because I needed him to believe that I was exactly what the registry said I was. A galactic cipher, he told me, was not simply an encryption system. It was the mathematical signature of a species' consciousness, a living proof, generated from the unique shape of a civilization's logic, its decision-making architecture, its way of structuring meaning. Every sovereign species had one. It took centuries to develop naturally. No species had ever produced one in less than 200 years. No species had ever decoded another's cipher without direct access to their core systems, which was considered the gravest violation in sovereignty law. The cipher was the key to everything, to treaties, to communication at the highest level, to being recognized as a full participant in galactic civilization. Without one, a species could observe, it could attend, it could be present, but it could not be heard. He said all of this with great kindness. He said it the way a doctor explains a long illness to a patient who has plenty of time to wait. I thanked him for explaining it. He smiled his warm and weightless smile. He moved on to speak with a Tier 2 delegation from a species whose name translated roughly as the rimwort, hegemony, and I watched him go and I thought about the drive in my pocket. The night of the first day ended without incident. I attended the dinner. I spoke to a dozen delegations. I was polite and curious and invisible. Later in my room, I sat at the window again and looked out at the stars and thought about what Colin Price had told me 3 weeks before I left. He had said, they have been broadcasting their cipher signals for 1100 years. They broadcast fragments in every formal transmission, every treaty document, every interspecies communication protocol. They do this as ceremony. They do this as greeting. They do not do this carefully, because it has never occurred to any of them that a pre-cipher species might be listening. He had said, we were listening. We have always been listening. He had said, 60 years ago the first fragment arrived. It was embedded in a routine deep space signal, and a graduate student at a facility in Ghana named Abena Mensah noted something in the mathematical structure that did not fit standard noise patterns. She spent 6 months analyzing it before she told anyone. When she told her supervisor, he spent 6 months analyzing it before he told anyone. This is how it went for 60 years, careful, quiet, passed hand to hand through a community of people who understood exactly what they were holding and exactly what it meant to get it wrong. He had said, we did not steal it. We did not break into anything. We listened. We thought. We rebuilt their mathematics from the outside in, the way you might reconstruct a machine from studying what it does, rather than what it looks like. We are very good at that. We have been very good at that since before we had electricity. I sat at the window for a long time that night. Outside the stars did not move. They never moved, really. That was one of the things I had always found strangely steadying about them. I went to sleep with the drive in my hand. On the morning of the second day, I found something that surprised me. Not because it was unexpected. I had read about it in the briefing documents. I had seen references to it in translated sovereignty records. I had known intellectually that it existed. But knowing something intellectually and seeing it with your own eyes are two different experiences. And when I walked into the secondary observation hall and stood in front of the cipher display, I stopped moving entirely for almost a full minute. The display was not an exhibit. It was not a museum piece. It was a live broadcast, a rotating visual representation of every sovereign species, cipher architecture, cycling through each one in turn, displayed as a kind of light structure in the air above a curved platform in the center of the room. A Tier 1 cipher looked like a living lattice, thousands of interlocking geometric shapes shifting and rotating in patterns so complex that watching them felt like trying to count raindrops. A Tier 2 cipher was simpler but faster, moving with the kind of confident speed that came from deep certainty. Tier 3 ciphers moved more slowly, some of them still clearly growing, still developing new branches, still finding their shape. None of this was what stopped me. What stopped me was that I recognized them, not vaguely, not in the way that something familiar might trigger a passing association. I recognized them the way you recognize your own handwriting. I had spent 4 years staring at mathematical reconstructions of these exact structures on screens in a basement research facility in Edinburgh, and seeing them displayed here in full light, seeing them alive and moving instead of rendered in gray lines on a flat surface, was something that pressed on my chest in a way I had not anticipated. The Veth coral cipher rotated above the platform, silver and intricate, its outer lattice shifting through a recursive pattern that repeated every 47 seconds. I knew that pattern. I could have drawn it from memory. I knew the inner structure too, the 7-layer encoding system, the way the central node distributed meaning through the outer rings, the specific frequency at which the whole thing hummed if you translated it into sound. I knew it because we had rebuilt it, from scratch, from fragments, from 60 years of intercepted signals and patient analysis and a species-wide refusal to let a puzzle stay unsolved. I walked slowly around the platform, looking at each cipher in turn. The Isin Collective's cipher was amber-colored and moved in long, sweeping arcs. I knew it. The rimward hegemonies was compact and angular and generated new substructures at precise intervals. I knew that too. The pale consensus had a cipher that looked almost like music when rendered visually, flowing, irregular, deeply beautiful. I had spent 8 months on the pale consensus cipher alone, and the day we finished the first complete structural model of it, 4 people in the Edinburgh facility had cried. I walked all the way around the display, and then I stood at the edge of the room and I looked at my own hands for a moment. 60 years. That was how long we had been listening to these transmissions, not as background noise but as data, not as proof of beings we could never reach, but as problems we could solve. The first generation of researchers who worked on the Cipher project were dead now. Their work had been inherited by the next generation, and the next, passed down through funding cycles and classified archives and the quiet, stubborn persistence of people who believed that the answer was there, if you were patient enough to find it. Abina Mensa had died 12 years ago at the age of 91. She had never known how far the work went after her. I had read her original analysis notes. Her handwriting was careful and precise, and in the margins of her first notebook, next to the first fragment she had isolated, she had written 3 words, "This is something." She had been right. I left the display hall and went back to my room. I sat down and opened my tablet and looked at the full index one more time, not because I needed to review it, but because I needed to feel the weight of it. 14 complete cipher reconstructions, 3 additional partial models, each more than 80% complete, 60 years of work, thousands of researchers across 4 generations, all of it built from the outside, from listening, from thinking, from the entirely human habit of refusing to accept that a question had no answer. There was a message from Colin Price waiting for me. It was short. "The motion has been formally filed. The vote is scheduled for day 6. He said, "Be ready." I read the message twice. Then I closed the tablet and sat quietly for a while. And I thought about Suradin's patient explanation from the night before, and about the footnote on the registry wall, and about the word coherent, and about what it means to be ready. Then I went to the afternoon reception and smiled at everyone, and let them talk to me about patience. That evening, a Tier 2 delegate from the Isin Collective gave a short speech at the formal dinner. He was warm and eloquent, and he spoke about galactic diversity, and about how the sovereignty cherished all species at every stage of development, and he used Earth as an example, specifically as an example of the kind of species that showed great promise and would certainly find its place in the community of civilizations given enough time. He said it with complete sincerity. He said it the way you would describe a child learning to walk. The room received it with gentle approval. I sat at my table and I ate the food they had prepared for human biology, and I listened, and I thought about the drive in my pocket, and I thought, not long now. 2 days later, the Cipher Exchange was scheduled to begin, and I had already decided what I was going to do. The Cipher Exchange was the summit's central event, and the chamber where it took place was the largest space on the Pale Crown Station. I had seen images of it in the briefing materials, but images had not prepared me for the reality. The chamber was circular and enormous, carved of the station's central spine over a period of several decades by the founding species when they built this place. The ceiling rose so high above the floor that the upper portions were lost in a kind of engineered atmospheric haze, and the walls were covered in panels that could display any kind of data the attending delegations required. The seating was tiered, with the highest tier delegations at the chamber floor level. and the lower tiers ascending in graduated rows above them. My seat was at the very top of the observation gallery. I had a clear view of everything below, and everyone below had a clear view of exactly where I was seated if they happened to look up, which none of them did. The exchange began with the Tier 1 civilizations. Each species' senior diplomat approached the central platform and initiated a brief cipher broadcast, not a full transmission but a fragment, a formal greeting, a proof of presence. The Veth Coral Empire went first. Suradin walked to the platform with the ease of someone who had done this many times, and when the cipher appeared above him, silver, intricate, that 47-second recursive pattern I could have drawn from memory, the assembled chamber responded with a sound that I realized after a moment was something like a collective breath of recognition. Every species in that room knew that cipher. They had known it for centuries. It was as familiar to them as a face. I watched it rotate above the platform and I thought, I know you too. The exchange went on for 3 hours. Every sovereign species took their turn. Some brought full structural displays, others only brief fragments. The pale consensus cipher moved through the air like water and the chamber went genuinely quiet for a few seconds when it appeared, because even among beings who had seen it hundreds of times, it was still striking. I sat in the observation gallery, and I watched every single one, and I matched each of them against the models in my memory, checking details, noting the small differences between live display and reconstructed model, cataloging things that would be useful when I got home. When the exchange ended and the chamber began to empty for the afternoon break, a junior aide from the Sovereignty's administrative office climbed the stairs to the observation gallery and handed me a formal document on a thin, glass panel. She was young or appeared young. It was genuinely difficult to tell with species whose lifespans varied so dramatically, and she did not quite meet my eyes when she gave it to me. The document was the formal motion regarding Earth's observer status. I read it standing in the observation gallery while the last of the other delegations filed out below me. The language was careful and respectful. It acknowledged Earth's continued development. It recognized humanity's demonstrated interest in galactic participation. It expressed genuine hope for Earth's future advancement toward cipher coherence, and it formally proposed, with 11 of 12 possible votes already secured in preliminary consultation, that Earth's observer access to future summits be suspended pending demonstrated progress toward Tier 5 or higher classification. This was to be reviewed in 50 years. 50 years, one review, pending demonstrated progress. The language was so careful that if you read it quickly, you might almost miss what it was saying. It was saying, we have been patient with you, and patience has limits, and you are not yet worth the continued cost of a seat in this room. I folded the document and put it in my bag. Then I took out my tablet and wrote a short message to Colin Price. I said, I've read the motion. I'm ready. He responded in under a minute. He said, go ahead. I put the tablet away, and I sat down in my observation gallery seat and I looked out at the empty chamber below me, its ceiling lost in haze, its walls still faintly glowing from the cipher displays, and I thought about a Bene Mensa writing 3 words in the margin of a notebook, and about 4 generations of people passing a secret hand-to-hand across 60 years, and about the specific feeling of solving a problem that everyone else has decided cannot be solved. Then I went and formally requested the floor under Article 7 of the Galactic Assembly Procedural Code. Article 7 was old. It predated the current structure of the sovereignty by several centuries, and it had been written into the foundational law during a period when the founding species were still cautious about concentrations of power. It said, in its entirety, any recognized species delegate present at a summit session retains the right to address the full chamber on a matter of galactic security, to be exercised once per summit, subject only to formal registration with the procedural office. I filed the registration at the procedural desk outside the main chamber. The clerk who received it looked at the form for a moment and then looked at me. She said, this is rarely used, I said. I know, she said. It cannot be revoked once filed, I said. I know that too. She entered it into the system. She gave me a registration stamp, she said. You are scheduled for tomorrow morning, the start of the Day 6 open session. I thanked her and went back to my room. I did not sleep much that night. I sat at the window for a long time and looked at the stars and thought carefully about everything that was about to happen. I was not frightened exactly. Fear was not quite the right word for what I felt. It was more like the feeling before you step off a very high place into water you know is deep enough. Your body's awareness of the drop, sharpened to complete clarity. I took the drive out of my pocket and held it in my hand. I had held it so many times in the past months that it had worn a faint impression into the pad of my thumb. I turned it over once. Then I put it on the desk in front of me, and I opened my tablet, and I spent 3 hours reviewing everything on it. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to arrive at morning, with the whole shape of it fresh in my mind. 14 complete reconstructions. 3 partial models, 1 index, cross-referenced, annotated, verified 4 times by 4 separate teams. 60 years of work. Thousands of people who had lived and worked and passed it on, without ever being able to tell anyone what they had done. I thought about all of them for a while. I thought about what they had given me to carry. Then I went to bed and slept for 5 hours and woke up before my alarm. Morning came sharp and cold, the way mornings did on the Pale Crown, the station's internal lighting cycling up through a slow blue-white that was meant to approximate sunrise. I dressed carefully. I wore the formal delegate coat Earth's briefing team had prepared for me. Deep gray, no decoration, the small Earth seal at the collar. I put the drive in my left jacket pocket. I had a cup of the station's version of tea, which tasted almost but not entirely right. I stood at the window one more time and looked out at the stars. Then I walked to the main chamber. The Day 6 open session had a formal structure. The first hour was for procedural matters, review of previous day votes, scheduling confirmations, official announcements. My Article 7 address was listed third on the procedural agenda, which meant I had approximately 40 minutes to wait while the chamber filled and the opening business was conducted. I sat in my observation gallery seat, and I watched the space below me fill with the assembled delegations of 16 sovereign civilizations, and I was aware, with every minute that passed, of the drive in my pocket. Suradin was at the Veth Choral table. He did not look up at the observation gallery. None of them did. The procedural business ran through its first 2 items, and then the session chair, a tall being from one of the founding species, whose name I knew but whose gender I had never been able to determine, announced the third item. An Article 7 address had been filed by the Earth delegation. Earth's delegate, Dr. Zara Osei, was recognized. The chamber did not react to this with excitement. It reacted the way a very large, very sophisticated room reacts to a minor administrative item, with patience, with politeness, with the particular quality of attention you give to something you expect. Will be brief and unremarkable. Several delegates below me shifted in their seats to achieve a better angle of view toward the observation gallery. A few more did not bother to look up at all. I walked down the long steps from the observation gallery to the chamber floor. The walk took almost 2 minutes. It was a very long staircase. I was aware of every step. When I reached the floor and walked to the central platform, the chamber was very quiet, and I stood at the platform in my gray coat with the Earth seal at my collar. And I looked out at 16 sovereign civilizations, and I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, I am here to discuss a matter of galactic security. I pulled the drive from my pocket. I plugged it into the platform's universal data port, and I began. The first image that appeared on the chamber walls was the Veth Choral cipher. Not a fragment, not a visual representation, a complete structural map, every layer, every encoding node, every recursive pattern, annotated and labeled in both standard sovereignty mathematical notation and the specific analytical language that the Edinburgh team had developed over decades of reconstruction work. It covered the walls from floor to the lower edge of the ceiling haze, enormous and detailed and undeniably, unmistakably real. The chamber went completely quiet. I do not mean quiet in the ordinary sense. I mean quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when something has shifted so fundamentally that sound itself seems uncertain of its place. I looked at Suradin. His expression had not changed yet. He was still wearing the patient, smooth expression of a diplomat who had seen many things. I watched his eyes move across the display on the wall. I watched his expression go very still. Then I said, this is a complete structural reconstruction of the Veth Choral Imperial cipher. It was built by a team of human researchers over a period of 22 years, using only publicly broadcast sovereignty transmission fragments. No sovereign system was accessed. No protocols were violated. This was done entirely through mathematical analysis and pattern reconstruction, conducted within Earth's own territory. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, I have 13 more. The chamber found its sound again. It came back in pieces, a ripple of movement, a low murmur of translated voices, the sound of beings who had lived long and seen much encountering something genuinely new. I watched it move through the room like a wave moving through water, and I stood at the platform and I kept my hands very still. I showed them the Isin collective cipher next, complete, then the Rimward hegemony, complete, then the Pale consensus, complete, with a note explaining that this one had taken 11 months longer than any of the others, because the mathematical architecture was, as I said clearly and without performance, Genuinely extraordinary, and the team had wanted to make sure they had it right. At this point, a delegate from the Pale Consensus stood up. He was one of the tall, luminous beings whose species I had always found difficult to read emotionally. He stood up and he said something in his own language, and the translation came a half-second later through my earpiece. "This is not possible," I said. "With respect, it clearly is." I showed them 4 more. 8 total, displayed on the chamber walls one after another, each one annotated, each one accompanied by a brief explanation of the specific mathematical method used to reconstruct it. The room's noise had gone up and then come down again, and now it was something different. It was the specific quiet of a very large number of highly intelligent beings who were thinking very hard and very fast. Suradin was still in his seat. His expression was composed. I gave him that. Across 300 years, he had learned composure the way you learn to breathe. Automatically, without thinking, in any condition. But his eyes had not left the display since the first image appeared. I stopped at 8. I let the 8th cipher stay on the walls. Then I said, "Earth has no intention of publishing these reconstructions. We have no intention of broadcasting them, distributing them, or using them as a basis for any kind of claim against any sovereign species." The reconstruction of these ciphers was a scientific effort. It was conducted by researchers who understood the sensitivity of what they were working with, and who handled that sensitivity with care across 4 generations. I looked out at the chamber. I looked at all of them. I said, "This is not a threat. I want to be very clear about that. I am standing here today because in approximately 16 hours, this chamber intends to vote to remove Earth from all future summit access on the grounds that we have not yet achieved cipher coherence." I paused. I am standing here to suggest that the premise of that vote may need to be reconsidered. Another wave moved through the room. This one was different from the first. The first had been shock. This one was something more complicated. The specific texture of an assumption, cracking open, slowly, along lines that had always been there but had never been tested. I said, "My species was classified as pre-cipher, not yet coherent." The assumption behind those words is that we are behind, that we are traveling the same road as every sovereign civilization here, only more slowly, only further back. I want to suggest a different possibility. I pressed a key on the platform. The 8 ciphers on the wall collapsed into a single display, a side-by-side comparison of all 14 reconstructed models, arranged by complexity and completion date, with a timeline running beneath them. We were not traveling the same road. We were traveling a parallel one. We did not have FTL travel. We did not have a unified government. Our lifespans are short, and our planet has, at various points in our recent history, been a difficult place to conduct peaceful research. None of these things stopped the work, because the work did not require any of them. It required listening. It required thinking. It required the particular stubbornness of a species that is constitutionally incapable of leaving a problem alone. Once it has noticed the problem, exists. I looked at Suradin one more time. I said, "I have 14. We are still working on the remaining 3. And then, because it was the honest thing to say and because I believed it completely, I said, "We would like to be properly met." The chamber was quiet for a long time. Then it was not quiet anymore. The session chair called a recess 12 minutes after my presentation ended. In practice, this meant that the chamber dissolved in controlled disarray. Delegations standing, moving toward each other, speaking in urgent undertones, the translation systems working at full capacity to keep up with a room that had suddenly started talking in 7 languages at once. I stood at the central platform and I watched it happen, and I did not feel triumphant. Triumph was not the right word. I felt the way you feel after you have finally said the thing that has been pressing against the inside of your chest for a very long time. A kind of spaciousness and expansion, the physical sensation of weight redistributed. 2 sovereignty security officers appeared at my side almost immediately. They were polite. They were also very firm. They explained that the council would need time to deliberate, and that, as a courtesy, they would like to escort me to a private conference room. Wait, I agreed. As I walked with them toward the side passage, I was aware that several dozen pairs of eyes were following me, and that most of them were expressions I had not seen on any of these species before. Not the warm patience, not the polite distance, not the gentle condescension of beings who had decided what kind of thing I was before I opened my mouth. They were looking at me the way you look at something you did not correctly classify. The conference room was small and well lit with a table, 4 chairs and a view of space through a narrow port. I sat down. I put the drive on the table in front of me. I drank a glass of water that tasted clean and cold. I waited for 20 minutes. Then the door opened and Suradin came in. He came alone. which I had not expected. He sat across from me. He did not have any of his usual diplomatic materials with him. No tablet, no aid, no document case. He sat across from me the way a person sits when they have decided to speak without armor. He looked at the drive on the table for a moment. Then he looked at me. He said, "How? Not how did you do this? Not how is this possible? Just how?" The single word of a being whose categories have been reorganized without warning. I said, "Pattern recognition. Mathematical reconstruction." 60 years of very attentive listening, he said. "Our ciphers are not broadcast in any complete form, only fragments. The fragments are not sequential, and the mathematical keys are embedded in contextual structures that require centuries of cultural immersion to interpret," I said. "That is what everyone assumed. Our first researchers made the same assumption. Then one of them, a woman named Abena Mensa, in 1974 by Earth's calendar, noticed that the mathematical architecture of the fragments was not random. The fragments were not pieces of the cipher. They were reflections of it, the way a small piece of a mirror reflects the whole mirror's curve, if you know what angle to look from. Once she noticed that, the rest was a question of time and method, and people willing to spend their careers on something they could not tell anyone about." Suradin was quiet for a moment. He said, "Your species has been doing this for 60 years. I said, "The active reconstruction project." "Yes. The passive signal collection goes back further. We have been receiving sovereignty transmissions for nearly a century," he said, "and no one outside Earth knew." I said, "The project had classification ratings that put it beyond the reach of most people with legitimate need to know access. It was not a deliberate secret from the sovereignty. It was a secret from everyone, including most of Earth's own governments, because the researchers involved understood that the work needed to be finished before it was shown to anyone. And because they believed, correctly, I think, that if it were shown incomplete, it would be taken away from them." Suradin put both hands on the table in front of him. This was a Veth choral gesture that I knew meant something close to "I am setting down what I was carrying to pick up what you are offering." I had read about it in a cultural analysis document 3 years earlier and had never expected to see it directed at me. He said, "Your species has short lifespans," said 60 to 90 years typically, he said. "The project ran for 60 years, I said. "Yes," he said. "That means it ran across multiple generations of researchers. The people who started it did not live to finish it." I said, "Most of them did not." "No." He was quiet again. When he spoke this time, there was something different in his voice. The smoothness was still there. Centuries of practice do not dissolve in a morning, but underneath it was something genuine. He said, "They worked on something they knew they would not complete." I said, "Yes." He said, "For the benefit of people they had not met yet." I said, "Yes." He looked at the drive on the table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Is there anything of ours that you have not decoded?" I thought of the 3 incomplete models, one at 84%, one at 71, one at 63, and the teams who were still working on them in the Edinburgh facility, and in the research station in Nairobi that had joined the project in the 4th decade. I thought of the specific problem in the 63% model that had blocked progress for 18 months, and the 3 competing theoretical approaches that were currently being tested simultaneously. I said, "Yes. We have 3 models that are still incomplete. We are still working on those." He was quiet for a long time. Then very slowly, something happened to his expression that I do not have a precise word for. It was not surprise. He was past surprise. It was not alarm. It was something that I can only describe as the moment when a very experienced navigator realizes that the territory is genuinely larger than the map. He said, "Still working." I said, "We find it difficult to leave things unfinished." He looked at me. "Not the way you look at a curiosity. Not the way you look at a potential problem. The way you look at something that has just demonstrated to you that your estimation of it was built on a foundation you did not know was missing." He said, "Are you aware of what you are asking for? Not the Tier 3 classification, not the formal language of the motion, what you are actually asking for underneath all of that." I said, "I am asking to be seen accurately." He sat back slightly. He said, "That is more complicated than it sounds." I said, "I know." He said, "There are species in that chamber who have held Tier 1 status for 800 years. Their identity in this community is built on what they are, and part of what they are is a certainty about what lesser developed species are. You are asking them to revise a category that they have not questioned in centuries." I said, "I am asking them to revise a measurement that gave them an inaccurate answer. Measurement tools get updated. That is not a threat to the species doing the measuring." He looked at me for another long moment. Then he said something I had not expected. He said, "Dr. Osi, I owe you an apology." I said nothing. I waited. He said, when I spoke to you on the first evening when I explained the cipher to you, I was condescending. I was not unkind, but I was condescending. I explained something to you as though you were incapable of already knowing it. I made an assumption based on a classification, and the classification was wrong, and I compounded the error by not questioning it even when I was speaking directly with you. He paused. That is not something I do carelessly. I have lived too long and met too many species to make that kind of error without it reflecting something I need to examine, I said. I did not come here to receive apologies, he said. I know. I am offering one anyway. I looked at him across the table. I thought about the first evening, and the smile he had given me, and the patient explanation, and the footnote on the wall. I thought about 60 years of work done by people who had never stood in this room, I said. Accepted. He nodded. He said, the council will reconvene in 3 hours. I cannot tell you how the vote will go. There are delegations in that chamber who are frightened, not of Earth specifically, but of what you represent, an unknown capability that existed outside their awareness, a species that was doing something they were not watching. That will take time to process. He paused, but I will tell you this, the motion to suspend Earth Summit access will not pass today, I said. What will pass instead, he said. That depends on what you propose. I had been thinking about this since Edinburgh. I had been thinking about it on the transit pod. I had been thinking about it sitting in the observation gallery watching the cipher exchange. I said, a Cipher Integrity Consortium, an independent body whose function is to evaluate the structural security of sovereign species ciphers and recommend improvements, staffed by any species that demonstrates the relevant analytical capability, reporting to the full Sovereignty Council rather than to any individual tier. Suradin was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, you are not asking for a seat at the table, I said. We would like to help design the table. He stood up. He was very tall when he was standing. He looked at the drive one final time, and then he looked at me and he said 3 hours and he left. I sat in the conference room alone. I poured another glass of water. Outside the narrow port, space was exactly as dark and exactly as full as it always was, and the stars were in the same positions they had been in since long before any of us started naming them. I put the drive back in my pocket. I thought about Abena Mensa writing 3 words in a notebook margin, and I thought about all the hands that had carried the work after hers, and I thought about the 3 incomplete models still waiting in Edinburgh and Nairobi, and I thought about the 63% one specifically, the one with the structural problem that no one had solved yet, and I thought that, when I got home, I was going to look at it again with fresh eyes, because sometimes all it took was coming back to something after a long time away. 3 hours later, the council reconvened. The chamber was different when I walked back into it. Not physically, the same ceiling, the same walls, the same tiered seating. But something in the quality of attention had shifted. The delegations were settled differently from how they had been that morning. The small clusters and side conversations that had characterized the earlier session were gone. Every delegation was at its own table, contained, composed, watching the central platform, with an attention that was completely unlike the polite patience of before. I walked from the side entrance to the floor platform, and this time no one looked at me sideways. Every eye in the room tracked me directly. I stood at the platform. I did not speak first. The session chair said, the council has completed its preliminary deliberations regarding the Article 7 address submitted by Earth's delegation. Before proceeding to any formal vote, the council has several questions for Dr. Osi, which will be conducted under the open session rules. Dr. Osi, are you willing to respond? I said yes. The first question came from the pale consensus delegation, the tall, luminous being who had stood during my presentation and said this is not possible. His name in the translation system resolved as something like Warden of the Deep Pattern, which was a title rather than a name, and when he spoke his voice was exactly as beautiful and strange as his Psi's cipher. He said, Dr. Osi, the reconstruction methodology you described, mathematical analysis of broadcast fragments, requires the assumption that fragment structures reflect the deep architecture of the source cipher. How did your initial researchers establish that assumption? How did they verify it without access to a complete cipher for comparison? It was a good question. It was, in fact, the exact question that Abena Mensa had spent 6 months on in 1974, working alone in a research facility in Ghana with equipment that would look primitive to anyone in this room, I said. She did not establish it initially. She hypothesized it and then tested it by asking a different question. Rather than asking whether the fragments reflected the cipher's structure, she asked why the broadcast patterns repeated the way they did. Specifically, She found that certain fragment sequences appeared at predictable intervals, regardless of the content of the surrounding transmission. She determined that these sequences were not content. They were markers, mathematical punctuation, and if they were punctuation, they implied a grammar. She spent 6 months mapping that grammar before she was confident enough to describe it to anyone. I paused. Her original notebook described this as an extremely tedious process. She was not wrong. A small sound moved through the chamber. It was not laughter exactly. It was something adjacent to it. The sound of beings recognizing a quality they were not expecting to find in this particular context. The Rimward Hegemony delegate asked about verification. I explained the 4-team independent verification process. 4 separate groups, no shared communication, working on the same cipher model and then comparing results. It had added years to the timeline. The researchers who proposed it had argued that if they were going to present this to the world, or eventually to the galaxy, they needed to be completely certain that they had not convinced themselves of something that was not true. The Yisan Collective delegate asked about security intent. I gave the same answer I had given in my presentation. No publication, no weaponization, no distribution. The models existed as scientific documentation. They had never been used for anything except understanding, I said. We are a species that finds things interesting. We find your ciphers extremely interesting. That is, in our experience, the most reliable reason to spend 60 years on something. The delegate from the Pale Consensus, Warden of the Deep Pattern, asked one more question. Dr. Osi, you mentioned that 3 cipher reconstructions remain incomplete. Can you tell us which 3? I named them. The chamber reacted slightly to each name. Small movements, small sounds. The specific response of species hearing their own names in a context they had not anticipated. Then the warden said something I had not expected at all. He said, "The Pale Consensus cipher took your team 11 months longer than any other. You said the team wanted to be certain they had it right because the architecture was extraordinary." He paused. "We have spent 400 years building it. No other species has ever commented on its architecture," I said. "It is the most complex structure I have ever studied. The way the central meaning distribution system interacts with the outer harmonic lattice. It is not like any of the others. It feels like something that grew, rather than something that was designed. It feels alive in a mathematical sense that I do not have precise language for." The warden was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is exactly what it is." Another silence settled over the chamber. This one was different from all the others. This one had warmth in it. The formal deliberation took 40 minutes. I stood at the side of the chamber floor while the voting occurred, watching the board on the far wall as the tallies came in. The motion to suspend Earth's summit access was withdrawn before it came to a vote. Sura, Dean moved the withdrawal, and it was seconded immediately by the Pale Consensus and carried by 12 votes with no opposition. A second motion was introduced. It proposed the establishment of a Cipher Integrity Consortium, with Earth as founding analytical member, operating under sovereignty oversight and reporting to the full council. Membership would be open to any species demonstrating relevant capability. Funding would come from the General Sovereignty Infrastructure Budget. The vote was 9-3. A third motion immediately followed. It proposed Earth's elevation to Tier 2 provisional status, the highest classification ever granted to a species that had not yet developed its own native cipher, with full review in 20 years rather than the standard 50. The vote was 11-1. The session chair announced the results. The chamber did not erupt the way chambers sometimes do in stories. It did not break into acclaim or spectacle. What happened was quieter, and I thought, more real than that. The delegations around the room looked at each other, and then they looked at me, and the quality of that looking was entirely different from any attention I had received since I stepped off the transit pod on the first day. There was no performance in it. There was no patient warmth or careful distance. They were looking at me the way you look at someone you have just decided to take seriously. Suradin caught my eye from across the room. He gave me a very small nod. I returned it. The session chair adjourned the formal business and moved to open deliberation, and the room shifted from formal structure to the kind of movement and conversation that follows a significant change. People moving toward each other. Things being said that needed to be said in smaller groups rather than on the public record. I was approached by 4 separate delegations in the first 10 minutes. All of them had questions. All of them listened to the answers carefully. None of them made me feel like a curiosity. The warden of the Deep Pattern found me near the side passage. He was accompanied by a younger member of his delegation, a being who had the same luminous quality but in a lighter register, like a newer version of the same light. The warden said, "We would like to offer something." As an opening gesture to the consortium work, I said, "What kind of offer?" I said. "The Pale Consensus cipher has 7 structural layers. You have reconstructed all 7. But there is an 8th layer that no species outside our own has ever detected. It is not broadcast in any transmission. It is the layer we added last, 400 years after we began, when we felt the cipher had finally reached its final form." He paused. "We would like to show it to you." I looked at him. I thought about the team in Edinburgh. I thought about the lead researcher there, a quiet, meticulous woman named Caroline Webb, who had spent more time on the Pale Consensus model than anyone else on the project, and who was, at this moment, probably eating lunch in the facility cafeteria, entirely unaware that this conversation was happening. I said, "Caroline is going to want to cry again." The warden did not know who Caroline was. He understood enough of what I had said to recognize the tone. He said, "This is how your species responds to complex mathematical structures." I said, "It is how we respond to things that matter." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, we do too." That evening there was a formal dinner, a proper one this time. Not the early summit social version, but a real occasion, deliberate and warm. I sat at the floor level, not in the observation gallery, at the floor tables, with the Tier 1 and Tier 2 delegations, at a table that had been set with a place for me between the Pale Consensus and a Tier 1 species called the Aureate Compact, whose language I had been studying for 6 years and had never expected to speak with their representatives directly. I had one real conversation that evening that stayed with me above all the others. It was with Suradin, late in the dinner when most of the formal exchanges had concluded and the event had settled into something more relaxed. He said, "I want to ask you something honestly," I said. "Yes," he said, "your researchers, the ones who started this 60 years ago, the ones who worked on it and passed it on and never saw it completed. Did they know it would come to this?" I thought about Abena Mensa. I thought about her notebook. I thought about what kind of person spends 6 months alone on a problem that no one around them can even confirm is real, and then spends the next 30 years quietly turning a hypothesis into a framework and passing it to the people who would come after her. I said, "I think they knew it would come to something. They believed the work mattered. That is not the same as knowing where it ends up." He said, "It is a very human thing, I think, to work toward a destination you cannot see." I said, "Is that strange to you?" He thought about it. He said, "It is not strange. It is humbling. I have lived 300 years, and I have always been able to see most of what I was working toward. I cannot imagine what it is like to work in the dark and trust that the light exists." I said, "It is uncomfortable, but we are very practiced at it." He smiled. This time it was different from the smile he had given me on the first evening. It was not the smile you give to something smaller than you. It was the smile of someone who has just revised an estimate significantly upward and found the revision genuinely pleasing. He said, "Are human beings frightening, Dr. Osi?" I thought about it honestly. I thought about the drive in my pocket, and the 60 years of quiet work, and the 3 incomplete models waiting at home, and the 63% one with the structural problem that no one had solved yet. I said, "We are not trying to be. We are just very bad at leaving things alone." He said, "That is perhaps the most frightening thing of all." We both laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, mutual, the kind that arrives when 2 people recognize the same absurdity at the same time. It was the first moment on this station that had felt entirely, simply, humanly real. I boarded the transit pod on the morning of day 7 with the Day 2 provisional credential chip in my pocket and a set of encrypted communication keys for the Cipher Integrity Consortium's initial working group. Suradin was at the transit dock. Several other delegations had come as well, not to make speeches, just to be present. This was, I was told later, unusual. Transit departures were not typically attended. I did not know how to feel about that except grateful. The pod launched, and the pale crown station grew small and then smaller, and then became a shape against the dark, and then it was only a point of reflected light, and then it was gone. I was alone in the transit compartment for the first leg of the journey. I took out my tablet. I opened the cipher index. I scrolled to the 63% model, the incomplete one, the stubborn one, the one that had resisted every approach the team had tried for 18 months. I looked at the structural problem that had blocked it. I looked at it for a long time. I had a new piece of information now. The warden of the deep pattern had shown me the 8th layer of the Pale Consensus cipher, the one no one else had ever detected, and one of its architectural features was a solution type that I had not seen in any of the other 14 models, a way of bridging a structural gap using a harmonic principle rather than a mathematical one. It was elegant. and I had spent most of the formal dinner quietly turning it over in my mind. I looked at the gap in the 63% model. I looked at the harmonic principle. I thought about the relationship between them for a while. Then I began writing. I wrote for 3 hours without stopping. When I finally looked up, the transit pod had entered the standard corridor and the stars outside the window were moving in the familiar way that meant we were underway. My tea had gone cold. I had not noticed. I looked at what I had written. It was not a solution, not yet. It was a new approach, a new angle on the structural problem, a sketch of a method that might work and might not but that deserved to be tested. I saved it to the drive. Then I saved it to a second location, because careful habits are careful habits regardless of what day it is. I thought about Caroline Webb eating lunch in Edinburgh and the conversation I was going to have with her when I got home. I thought about telling her about the eighth layer, about the harmonic principle, about the warden's expression when I told him that understanding something that matters is how we respond to it. I thought about the 3 words Abena Mensah wrote in 1974 in the margin of a notebook that is now preserved in a climate-controlled case in the research facility in Ghana behind a small card that reads, Origin Document, Cipher Reconstruction Project, Restricted Archive. This is something. She had been right. She had no way of knowing how right, but she had been right. I looked out at the stars and I thought about all the other signals still traveling through that dark. All the transmissions from all the species we had not yet encountered. All the mathematical structures is still waiting to be listened to. All the problems still waiting for someone to notice them and refuse to look away. I thought about what it meant to be a species that could not leave things alone. Then I went back to work. They had called us a minor species. What they meant, I think, was that we were minor in the ways they knew how to measure. They had simply never thought to measure the rest. They were thinking about it now.